Hi all, welcome to ICAST 2020, and we're going to be talking about our conservation seminar series. And today we will be discussing these 30 by 30 initiatives that have been talked about anywhere from, the Sacramento Bee all the way up to the New York Times. There's been a lot of discussion about these initiatives, both at the national and the state level. And for those of you that haven't been tracking these types of legislation all that closely, it's a very simple concept. The goal is to protect 30% of US or state, depending on the jurisdiction you're talking about, 30% of state waters and lands by 2030. And on its face, that is something that I think, and I speak for ASA, but in general, I think the conservation community and the sportsman community can be supportive. However, all of it is in the details. So we have been working with our partners in California, specifically the Congressional Sportsman Foundation, CCA, and a couple other groups, to work on a bill called AB 3030. And it kind of pushes forward this initiative, the 30 by 30 goal. However, the language in the bill is incredibly ambiguous, and we can talk about perhaps why that is. But if we don't know what the word protect means in the legislation, that makes a lot of us concerned. So back about 10 years ago, there was a large push to expand marine protected areas in the state of California. And there's a lot of heartburn related to that within our community. It was a long fought battle, and unfortunately we were not successful, and there were a lot of closures that we saw in California. So the ambiguity in that specific bill, which Aveen will touch on, is something that is of a large concern to us. So first, I want to introduce our speakers today. We are so blessed to have Whit Fosberg from the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and he's the president and CEO. Welcome, Whit.
Thank you.
Of course. We also have Aveen Klein. She's the Western States Coordinator from the Congressional Sportsman Foundation all the way in California. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Great. Well, I think now we're going to segue into Aveen's discussion about some state level work that's been going on.
Hi, Danielle. So as you mentioned, thank you so much. AB 3030 was introduced this year in California. Just as you mentioned, it is addressing the not even nationwide, but global initiative to protect 30% of lands and 30% of waters by the year 2030. On its face, something that the sportsman's community could get behind, right? As America's original environmental conservationists, we, as the sportsman's community, have been there since day one, saying, how can we protect our resources to make sure that they're available for the next generation and the next generation, and for all outdoor enthusiasts to be able to enjoy, not just hunters and anglers. So AB 3030 was introduced, and we took a look at the bill, as we do, tracking all legislation that comes in and out of California and across the nation. And this bill raised some red flags. As you mentioned, it had this broad sweeping language. It read maybe a little bit more like a resolution than a typical piece of legislation. And that was because the goals were there, laudable goals to, set aside, protect our natural resources, address declining biodiversity, raising acidity levels in the ocean, pollution, all things that sportsmen are concerned with. But it didn't say how. And so that was the first tip. We said, hey, maybe we should take a closer look at this. We support your goal. How are you going to do that? And what does protect mean? Because protect can have a big broad structure, big broad spectrum of what that is. That could be active conservation, as we know it as sportsmen, through consumptive use, active forest management, active water management, or it could go to the other spectrum, and that's preservation. And the sportsman's community just can't support preservation. As you mentioned, the MPAs, that is what preservation is in California. Marine protected areas, when managed by the state of California, are no fish, no take zones. It was a process long battle in the 90s, and the sportsman's community came out on the other side of it. And this bill looks a lot like the MPA process. So as the sportsman's community in general, CSF, along with ASA and many of our other partners, went to the author and said, hey, we have these concerns, let's talk about them. The author brought in the sponsors of the bill. We sat down with them, multiple meetings to express our concerns and to propose some suggested amendments, including how to define protect, putting out an outline of what their 30% is. Does that include areas that are already protected? Or is that 30% of new protected lands and waters? And there's still a big question mark looming over those questions. And we're continuing to sit down with the authors. We're continuing to sit down with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to talk about this and how we can make this bill become something we can support. But currently, right now, the sportsman's community has come together as a whole and said, we oppose AB 3030 unless amended. And I want the ICAST listeners to know that and focus on the second part of that phrase, if amended, right? The 30 goal is something that we support and we can get behind, but we can't do it as California's bill is written now. It just misses the mark. So we have worked through this bill. It went all the way through the assembly in a matter of 12 days through a fiscal committee, a policy committee, and off the assembly floor in a matter of 12 days. That's fast. We're a fast moving California legislature in general, and COVID has just sped that up. And so we're seeing pressure on getting the bill through. We are seeing pressure from the author and the sponsors to get this through. So here we are, in July, and this bill is heading over to the Senate. It's been referred to its first policy committee in the Senate Natural Resources and Water, and the sportsman's community has banded together better than I've ever seen it come together to say, we're putting our foot down, we need a seat at the table, and our concerns need to be heard.
That's right. And just one thing that I'll add is, and I'm not sure if this is true for the lands portion of the bill, but 30% of California state waters already would fall under that designation, if I'm remembering correctly. So without the existing protections being incorporated into this mandate, if it were to pass the legislature, we would have an additional 30% of state waters fall under protection. Whether or not that's necessary is in question in and of itself. But in general, the fishing community in the past has been, okay with minimal fishing closures when needed and when it's tested frequently and possibly reopened. We've seen that in different administrations. So, fishing closures in itself sometimes are needed, and we recognize that. But the ambiguity in the language really, really makes us worry that this is going to be used kind of willy-nilly to shut down fishing. And, I would say that the author's unwillingness to address that question specifically, will this legislation lead to fishing closures? We have not gotten an answer on that question, as far as I'm concerned. AB, you can correct me if that's wrong. But, the lack of an answer to that question kind of reaffirms some of our concerns that we've had throughout the whole process.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Danielle. And that's, I think, without defining what protect is, and then without answering the question of, what is going to be protected, or is already protected. Those are two big question marks over this bill. And we've been asking that, and we haven't been getting an answer. So that's what I called it, the heartburn is bringing up, especially in the fishing community, through the Marine Life Protection Act of the 90s, right? It was the same type of deal, kind of broad, sweeping language. The authors and the sponsors assured the fishing community that their intent was not to have closures. Through the regulatory process, we got MPAs and said, we're going to close these until we can study it and open it. Supposed to be done 10 years following, it still to this date hasn't been done. So that leaves a lot of questions for the sportsman's community, especially for fishing. And to sit down with the author of the bill very early to ask, about our questions, the things we've been talking about, and not getting that answer has been troublesome, because this seems like the easiest questions for the bill to me. But we'll see, and we're continuing to fight and band with our partners like ASA, TRCP to try to answer these questions, or make sure that this bill doesn't get through and end up being another MPA 2.0 for California.
Absolutely. And I think maybe you can speak on some other completely unrelated industries that are also probably going to be implicated in something like this if enacted. Things like the Builders Association, I believe. I assume water users as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not just a sportsman's bill. 30%, an additional 30% of lands and waters in California are locked down. That not only affects the fishermen, our recreational fishermen, but our commercial fishermen. That affects renewable wind energy. That affects kind of restoration management. That affects the Builders Association, ag, timber, forestry, affordable housing. So that's a huge deal in California. California is an expensive state. It's hard to live here, and it's hard to find affordable housing. If we lock up big portions of land, how are people going to be able to live? So this bill has a widespread impact, far and beyond the hunting and fishing communities.
That's right. That's right. Can you speak on a couple other states that have looked at similar but different types of legislation that you have been tracking, or your organization has been tracking?
Absolutely. So the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation tracks legislation from Capitol Hill across all 50 states. And this 30 by 30 initiative, we've seen it in California, it's moving in California, but like a lot of bills, they start in California. We have also seen a 30 by 30 bill introduced in South Carolina. That bill is a different beast than California's, but it does provide a definition of protect, which is something we've been asking for here. And it does explicitly acknowledge in the language the contribution of the sportsman's community and the long-standing history of what we've done for conservation, not only monetarily through the American System of Conservation Funding, but on the ground through our NGO partners and the wetlands restoration to watershed and habitat management and everything in between, big game down to, the smallest fish species to flora and fauna. So we've seen it in South Carolina. We've also seen a resolution introduced in Illinois with the same type of language, 30 by 30, but it does recognize the sportsman's communities as contributors to conservation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would imagine that at least from our perspective, the folks that are pushing this legislation in California are kind of looking at California as a starting off point. They can achieve this in California, it might be worth moving on to a national level type policy. And that's why we have Whit here from TRCP, who can speak on that a little bit for us and some momentum that we've seen in the last month or so.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. And what Aveen talks about in California, I think is sort of it is a warning shot for not only nationally, but we're seeing it around the globe. I mean, this is something the IUCN has embraced and talked about, and really for good reason. I mean, we're losing biodiversity on a global scale at huge rates. And you think about rainforests in South America or unique habitats other places. I mean, you clearly need a hard protection strategy to deal with some of those areas. I mean, obviously, the United States has been practicing conservation a lot longer than anybody else, and we largely have our act together on this one, and which makes things like California scary because a slogan should not be driving policy. And 30 by 30 sounds great, but the devil is in the details in all this. And you're starting to see that same sort of slogan coming out of political campaigns. We saw it come out of a House report that came out yesterday, the day before, recently. The Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, the Democratic Committee, produced a report that talks about this. And honestly, I like the idea. I mean, I like big, hairy, audacious goals. I like shooting for something, but it all depends on the details. And I think that you even saw an evolution from the sort of problems in California with the Marine Life Protected Act over time. I mean, even the Obama administration, when they designated new marine monuments, they specifically allowed recreational fishing because they recognized, one, recreational fishing does not cause damage to habitat, to species, provided it's well managed. It usually is. And second, you need the angler support for this. I mean, we should not be fighting conservation. We should be arm in arm with folks who want areas protected because our goals are the same. I mean, we don't want to see an area industrialized. We don't want to see it raped. I mean, let's get with it, but let's do this in a way that works for the folks that are out there every day practicing conservation, have been for 100 years. So right there now, I think you think about the terrestrial side, and it's even scarier. I mean, what about, some sort of working forest is under permanent conservation easement? Is that going to be all of a sudden not counted? Our lands under, farmlands under permanent conservation easement. The threat is not, sustainable farming or sustainable logging. It is condos. It is a Walmart coming in someplace. It is, being industrialized. And, so the authors, have to be careful. And it's going to start in California because we see in other places, clean air, clean water, a lot of other things. What happens in California creates a national precedent. So we need to get together like, CSF and others are doing in California right now with the sponsors and embrace the broad goals, but make sure that the definitions are there to make this work in practice because, the forces of anti-conservation will spin this stuff to scare people, if you can't define this. And I can guarantee that PETA and, TRCP have very different ideas what protect means. And we're not going to come together on those. So we need to have these collaborative processes like we're having right now in California, I hope, to come up with a good definition there so we aren't fighting these things, on a piecemeal basis or even nationally.
Right. And thank you for that. I think, there's been a lot of momentum at the national level, and I think this is obviously a really important year politically. How would you imagine this playing out if the administration does not flip come November?
I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now is a lot of conservation is state-based anyway right now. And even from climate change to, a variety of other things, you're seeing, I think, the most innovative and aggressive work being done at the state level because, big conservation initiatives are not necessarily going to come out of this administration. That's probably true, even if a new Biden administration comes in, that's where you could sort of see I think a scarier scenario of wanting to do the right thing, but doing it clumsily and alienating large tracts of the country that need to be supportive of conservation if we're going to achieve long-term biodiversity, climate, open space, goals. And, so I think that, listen, Congress has done a bunch of really good stuff in, last year and actually last few years. And we have the Great American Outdoors Act. We have the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, that is moving in the Congress right now. And that is good, common sense, sort of collaborative conservation that brings Democrats, Republicans, environmentalists, sportsmen, everybody together to work on a common cause. But it is the sloganeering that we're seeing in things like the 30 by 30 that threaten to undo those types of collaborative efforts.
Right, exactly. It could be quite polarizing. And I would imagine, say the administration flips come November, we might even see an executive order come from something like this, which
you potentially could. And I think it would be vague. It would be, aspirational. And then, comes upon all of us based on places we've seen it work, maybe like South Carolina, to say, okay, that sounds great. Let's put some definition behind that so we don't scare people and we make this thing actually work. And, maybe 30 by 30 is not ambitious enough. My guess is, if you add up the areas that are actually conserved in this country from a terrestrial standpoint, like we have in marine in California, we're above 30% already. Now, I want more conserved land, but I also want to make sure that things like, working forests that are permanently conserved are part of that discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Well,
not even working forests, but even coming from talking the federal side down to the states is the recent secretarial orders on wildlife migration corridors in the West, and talking spanning 7 to 10 states collaboratively work together. Well, if California shuts off and landlocks some of these, parcels of land, and can we no longer go on there to do active, wildlife management tracking, tracing, anything that comes along with, helping these big game species get from one place to another when we've developed all the way around their natural habitat. And so that's something to think about in the broader picture is if this is piecemeal done state by state, and we don't have a robust approach from the sportsman's community or suggestion, that this could look, like a quilt that doesn't quite flow together.
Absolutely. And, CSF has been such a great leader on kind of working to develop some pillars of understanding when it comes to these types of policies, things that we can get behind as a broader community, because like we said, this is coming whether or not we like it or not. So we want to remain on the table. Thank you all for joining today. We really appreciate you tuning in to these conservation seminars as we work through ICAST 2020. And thank you both to Whit and Aveen for joining us today. Thank you so much for your commentary. And I think, this is just a very small fraction of the coalition that will be working and is working on these issues going forward. And please, if you have any questions related to this seminar or anything related to 30 by 30, please reach out to me. You can see my email there. It's dcloutier@asafishing.org. And we hope you enjoy the rest of ICAST 2020. Thanks again.